It had been a long drive, longer than they had anticipated. The sun had set hours ago, and now, the only light was the eerie glow of the car's headlights cutting through the dense woods. Tom had been driving for what felt like an eternity. His fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the winding road ahead, while his best friend Sam sat next to him, occasionally glancing out of the passenger window. "Dude, are we lost?" Sam asked, breaking the silence. Tom frowned, pulling out the map from the glove compartment and glancing at it quickly. "No, we're fine. This road's just a little more remote than I thought." Sam nodded but still didn't look convinced. The trees around them seemed to grow thicker and more oppressive as they drove deeper into the forest. The dense canopy of leaves above blocked out most of the light from the moon, and the shadows stretched long across the road, making it difficult to make out what lay ahead. "It's creepy out here," Sam said, his voice barely audible. Tom didn't respond, his focus entirely on the road. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the hum of the car and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Neither of them had spoken much for the past few hours, the drive growing more unnerving as the night deepened. "Look," Sam said, pointing to the right side of the road, "there's a house over there." Tom squinted, trying to make out the building in the dim light. It was an old cabin, standing alone in the middle of the woods, with no lights on and no signs of life. It looked abandoned. The windows were dark, and the roof seemed to sag under the weight of time. "Just some old place," Tom muttered, not slowing down. "We should keep moving." But as they drove past, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it felt like someone, or something, was watching them from the shadows of the trees. "You okay, man?" Sam asked, noticing Tom's tense posture. "Yeah," Tom replied, but there was an edge to his voice. I don't know. It's getting weird out here." Sam was about to respond when he suddenly stopped, his eyes wide. He pointed ahead. "Tom, look." Tom slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as he jerked the car to a stop. In the middle of the road, standing motionless, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, wearing a tattered white dress, her hair long and tangled. She stood still, her hands hanging by her sides, her head tilted slightly to one side as she stared at them with wide, unblinking eyes. Tom's breath caught in his throat. What was a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere, alone, at this time of night? "Jesus Christ," Sam muttered, his voice thick with fear. Tom's hand trembled as he turned off the engine. The car was silent now, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The little girl didn't move, didn't say a word. She just stood there, watching them. Should we stop?" Sam asked, his voice a little more shaky now. Tom hesitated, staring at the girl. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. They were deep in the woods, miles from any town. There was no way a little girl should be out here, alone, in the middle of the night. "We can't just leave her out here," Tom said finally, though he didn't sound too sure. "We'll find out if she's okay, then get her back to her parents." With a deep breath, he opened the car door and stepped out, followed reluctantly by Sam. The air was colder now, and Tom's breath came out in small clouds as he walked cautiously toward the little girl. "Hey there," Tom called gently, trying to keep his voice calm, though his stomach twisted with unease. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Tom took another step toward her, but as he did, he noticed something strange. She wasn't standing on the road, but on a patch of grass that seemed to be growing toward the car. As though the road itself was pushing her to stay in front of it, like some invisible force was keeping her there. Tom stopped in his tracks, suddenly feeling a cold dread settle over him. He glanced back at Sam, who was standing a few steps behind him, looking pale and uncertain. "Something's not right," Sam whispered. Before Tom could respond, the little girl took a slow step toward him. Her bare feet made no sound as she moved across the grass, and when she reached Tom, she stopped just a few inches away, her face expressionless. "Do you need help?" Tom asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The girl tilted her head, staring at him with those wide, hollow eyes. "My parents," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're waiting." Tom blinked, confused. "Where are they, sweetheart?" The girl pointed behind them, toward the woods. But when Tom turned to look, he saw nothing but trees. The path beyond the road seemed endless, a maze of dark, towering trunks. "There's no one back there," Tom said, turning back to the girl. But she was gone. One second she was standing right in front of him, and the next, she had disappeared into the trees, vanishing as quickly as if she had never been there at all. Tom stood frozen for a moment, his eyes darting wildly around the woods, trying to see if he could catch a glimpse of her. "Where the hell did she go?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. Tom took a shaky breath. "I don't know. We need to get back in the car. Now." They turned and ran back toward the car, not daring to look back. The weight of the forest, the heavy silence, pressed in on them as they scrambled inside. Tom slammed the door shut and fumbled to start the engine. The car roared to life, and he quickly turned it around, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. As they sped away, neither of them spoke. The road ahead was now impossibly dark, the trees closing in on both sides. The encounter with the little girl seemed to be getting more surreal by the second. "What the hell was that?" Sam finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That wasn't real, right?" Tom didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure what had happened, what he had just seen. But as they drove through the woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone anymore. And in the distance, through the rearview mirror, he swore he saw a figure standing just outside the glow of the car's headlights. A little girl. But this time, she wasn't standing still. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The road stretched out in front of them, but the darkness seemed to close in, tightening around the car like a vice. Every sound, every movement felt magnified, as though the forest itself was alive and watching them. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, like an icy chill creeping up his spine. Sam sat beside him, his eyes wide and darting nervously from the road to the trees, scanning the darkness with a fearful intensity. "Tom, did you see that?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it," Tom replied, his voice strained. "But I don't know what it was. It didn't make sense." Sam didn't answer. He just continued to stare ahead, his gaze flicking back to the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if expecting something to appear there. The air in the car felt thick, oppressive, like it was hard to breathe. The headlights illuminated the winding road, but the trees on either side seemed to stretch out endlessly into the blackness. The car hummed steadily, but every now and then, a small sound, a rustling in the trees, would make both of them jump. Tom kept his foot on the gas pedal, trying to get as far away as possible from the cabin whatever had just happened. But the further they drove, the more it felt like the road was closing in around them. The path seemed to twist and turn, and the trees pressed closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. Tom's eyes darted to the rearview mirror again. He swore he saw something moving, just beyond the range of the headlights. He blinked and looked again. Nothing. His heart raced, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his skin prickling with unease. "You okay?" Sam asked, his voice tight. "I'm fine," Tom said, though he wasn't. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:45 a.m. They had been on this road for hours. It had felt like they had entered a different world, one that was somehow outside of time. The forest seemed to go on forever, and with each mile they drove, it felt like they were losing themselves in it. Suddenly, the car lurched, and Tom slammed his foot on the brake. The tires screeched as they skidded across the road, but Tom managed to bring the car to a stop just in time. Sam gasped, clutching the dashboard with both hands. "What the hell, Tom?" Sam shouted, his voice cracking. In front of them, the road was blocked. It wasn't an animal, or a fallen tree, or any other natural obstruction. It was something else. Something wrong. At first, Tom couldn't make it out clearly, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized what it was: a figure. A figure standing in the middle of the road. A girl. The same girl. The little girl in the white dress. Her hair hung long and tangled, her face shadowed, but her eyes, those wide, empty eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the headlights. She was standing perfectly still, her arms hanging by her sides, her expression blank. And again, she wasn't moving. Tom felt his blood freeze. This couldn't be happening. He had to be imagining it, but no, the girl was there. The same girl. He looked over at Sam, whose face was pale and expressionless. Is that the same girl?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. "I think so," Tom muttered, his mind struggling to process the reality of the situation. "But how? How is she here?" He didn't wait for Sam to answer. Without thinking, Tom threw the car into reverse, slamming on the gas pedal as the tires screeched once again. The car shot backward, the engine roaring as the headlights flickered with each jolt. "Tom, stop!" Sam shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't just leave her out there." But Tom's mind was made up. He wasn't going to get any closer to that girl, not with what had happened earlier. His pulse was racing, and a cold sweat began to form on his forehead. The forest felt alive, the shadows surrounding them shifting, whispering. It felt as if the world itself was closing in. He pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to get away. But as they sped back, Tom felt something change. The air grew colder, the trees thicker, and the road darker. No matter how fast he drove, it felt as if they were stuck in place. The trees pressed closer, the darkness seemed to stretch out infinitely ahead of them, and in the rearview mirror, the girl, she was there. She was following them. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he slammed on the brakes again, the car jerking forward with a loud thud. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror once more. There she was, in the reflection, only now, she wasn't standing still. She was moving, her limbs jerking unnaturally, almost as though she was being pulled forward by an unseen force. She was running, fast. Faster than any child should be able to run. "She's coming after us," Sam said, his voice barely a whisper. Tom didn't answer. He just floored the gas pedal again, his eyes wide with fear. The headlights cut through the darkness, but they weren't enough to dispel the thick shadows that pressed in on them from every direction. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the car, followed by a sharp jerk to the left. Tom's heart leaped into his throat, and he gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady the car. "What the hell?" Sam cried out. "What was that?" Tom's eyes shot to the road ahead. The girl was gone. But something was in the road. Something else. A figure. A man. A tall, gaunt figure, standing motionless in the center of the road. His face was pale, his clothes ragged, his eyes hollow and empty, just like the girl's. His mouth was stretched in a wide, grotesque grin. Tom slammed on the brakes again, the car screeching to a halt, narrowly missing the man's outstretched arm. "Jesus," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. "What the hell is going on?" But the man didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, smiling. That horrible, wide grin. And then, in the stillness of the night, the wind carried a sound. A whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Tom's heart raced as the whisper grew louder, suffocating the air around them, twisting his thoughts into knots. The words lingered in the cabin, floating in the stale, oppressive atmosphere like a curse, lingering far longer than they should have. "You're part of us now. There is no escape." Tom's eyes shifted to Sam, but the familiar face he had known for years was gone. Sam was staring straight ahead, his eyes wide, glazed over, as though he were no longer seeing the world around him but lost somewhere far beyond. His lips barely moved, forming words that didn't sound like his own. "We'll never leave." Tom's pulse thudded in his ears as he gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. The silence was deafening now, suffocating. The car, once a shield between them and whatever waited in the darkness outside, felt like a fragile cage, trapping them in place. Tom's mind was in turmoil. What was happening to Sam? To them? He could feel it. The forest. It was alive. The trees, the shadows, the air, everything was shifting, changing, alive in ways that were wrong, unnatural. The woods were no longer just trees. They were something darker, something ancient. It had been waiting for them. The road had disappeared. The path, the line that they had been following, was now swallowed by an endless sea of blackness. The symbols etched into the dirt pulsed like living things, shifting beneath the glow of the headlights. Tom's eyes flicked nervously back to the rearview mirror, and what he saw made his stomach churn. The girl was there again. Her face, pale and stretched, appeared in the reflection, but this time it was different. She wasn't standing still. She was moving. Her eyes, wide and empty, locked onto his through the rearview mirror, and the air grew colder. She was closer now, closer than ever before, and Tom could feel her presence, her gaze burrowing into him. No, not again, he thought desperately, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The engine roared to life, but it was too late. The headlights flickered, dimmed, and the engine sputtered once more. The car jerked and shuddered, the wheels spinning uselessly on the wet road. It was as if the road itself was fighting them, refusing to let them pass. Tom slammed his fist against the steering wheel, frustration and fear mingling. "Come on," he shouted, but there was no response from the car. No matter what he did, they were stuck. The symbols were glowing brighter now, filling the air with an eerie light. The trees were closing in. The forest was no longer just an external threat, it was pressing in on them from every direction, bending the very fabric of reality itself. Sam sat motionless beside him, no longer even acknowledging his presence. Tom looked over at him, his throat tight with dread. Sam's face was vacant, his eyes staring ahead unblinking, his lips moving in slow, almost robotic motions, but no words escaped them. "Sam?" Tom asked, his voice strained, a faint tremor in it. But there was no response. A terrible thought rose in Tom's mind. What if Sam had already been taken? What if he was already part of whatever twisted thing was haunting them? Another soft, muffled sound echoed from outside, the sound of footsteps, far too light and soft to belong to anything human. They came from behind them, slowly, deliberately, as if something or someone was pacing outside the car, taking its time, letting them know they were being watched. Tom felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, a cold shiver spreading through his spine. "Sam, get up!" Tom yelled, grabbing his friend by the shoulder, shaking him roughly. "We have to get out of here." But Sam didn't respond. He was empty, empty like the road ahead, like the space between them and the terrifying unknown. Then, suddenly, there was a knock on the window. Tom froze. His heart skipped a beat, and every muscle in his body tensed, locked in place. The sound, soft at first, but unmistakable, a tap, then another, and then more. As if someone was lightly rapping on the window, slow and methodical. Tom slowly turned his head, his breath shallow, dreading what he would see. Outside, standing by the driver's side window, was the figure. Not the girl this time, but the man. The man from before. His face was pale, stretched tight over bone, eyes hollow and dark. His clothes hung in tatters, his hands unnaturally long, fingers twitching as they gripped the frame of the window. His smile was even wider now. It was unnatural, a grotesque stretching of flesh, too wide to be real. "You should have listened," he whispered, his voice rasping as if it were coming from deep within the earth itself. The words didn't just enter Tom's ears, they entered his mind. They reverberated, bouncing off the walls of his skull. Tom's chest tightened. His breath became shallow, panic rising in his throat. "No, no, no," he muttered, shaking his head, his hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. "Leave, leave while you still can," the man whispered, his voice now a chilling echo in the car. "But it's too late now. The forest owns you. You're already part of it." Tom's head was spinning, his eyes wild. He couldn't think straight. The man's grin stretched even wider as he stepped back, vanishing into the shadows, blending into the blackness of the night. But the whisper remained, and it was everywhere, inside Tom's head, inside Sam's empty eyes, inside the very air around them. The darkness was closing in. The girl appeared again, this time in the rearview mirror, her face an expressionless void. Her smile had returned, wider than ever, stretching across her face like a grotesque mask. But this time, something had changed. There were more of them. Figures in the distance, just beyond the reach of the headlights. More shapes. More faces, coming closer. The trees around them were alive, shifting and rustling as the wind picked up. The symbols on the ground had spread now, the ground beneath the tires glowing with an unnatural light, pulsing, as though the earth itself was breathing. "Sam!" Tom screamed, shaking his friend once again. "Snap out of it. Please." But Sam didn't move. He didn't even blink. Tom's body felt as though it was being pulled into the seat, as if the very air around him had become thick with the weight of unseen forces. The car's interior was suffocating now, and the whispers had become a cacophony inside his head, 1,000 voices speaking at once, echoing in his thoughts, demanding attention. They were all around him, and yet, when he reached out to grasp them, he found only emptiness. The girl's voice rang out again, clearer this time, as if she were standing right next to him, her breath cold against his ear. "You belong to us now." The words were final, like a death sentence, and in that moment, Tom understood that the forest was not merely a place, it was a living entity, ancient and unyielding. It had a hunger that it satisfied with the souls of those who dared to venture too far into its depths. And it wasn't finished with him yet. Tom turned to look at Sam, hoping against hope that his friend would snap out of whatever trance he was in, but Sam's eyes were wide open, vacant and hollow, staring at nothing. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth hung slightly open, as though he were in a deep, irreversible sleep. It was as though Sam had been drained of all life, all consciousness. What was left was only a husk. Tom's throat tightened, his eyes brimming with tears, but there was no time for grief. He could feel the weight of the forest closing in, its cold embrace sinking deeper into his very soul. He wasn't sure what was happening, but it was becoming clearer by the second, they were no longer in control of their fate. The forest had taken them, and it would never let them go. He turned the key, desperately trying to start the car again, but the engine remained silent, unresponsive. The dashboard lights flickered once, then went dark. The car had become nothing more than a shell, a vessel trapped in an endless void. The whispers grew louder, their words more frantic now, as if they sensed his panic. A low growl rumbled from somewhere deep within the woods, a sound that seemed to come from the trees themselves, as though they were alive and hungry. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and a heavy, oppressive fog began to roll in from the trees. The mist curled around the car, creeping through the windows, shrouding everything in a pale, ghostly light. It was the fog of the forest, its breath, cold and damp, wrapping around them like a shroud. Tom's hands were trembling. He wiped his forehead, beads of sweat mingling with the cold moisture of the fog. He knew they had to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The trees stretched out endlessly, a maze of shadows that would never lead them to safety. The path ahead had disappeared, swallowed up by the darkness. They were trapped in this nightmare, prisoners of the very land they had driven into. And then, something changed. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, came from outside the car. It was like the flutter of wings. Tom's head snapped to the side, his pulse quickening. He thought he saw a shadow dart across the mist. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the fog, was the girl again. She was watching him, her head tilted slightly, as if considering him. Her face was still stretched in that grotesque smile, but this time, her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were different. There was something alive in them now, something more than just emptiness. They gleamed with an unsettling hunger, like they were waiting for him to make the wrong move. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what she wanted, but he knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. She wasn't done with him. The forest wasn't done with him. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, even though the car wasn't going anywhere. He could feel the vibrations of the engine, but it was as if the car was being held in place, the road beneath it now just an illusion. The fog swirled around them, and the shadows of the trees seemed to loom closer, pressing in from all sides. "Tom," Sam's voice croaked, barely a whisper. Tom whipped his head around, his heart racing. Sam's eyes were no longer vacant. They were filled with a strange, hollow understanding. Sam's lips trembled, his mouth forming words that didn't quite make sense. We need to go," Sam muttered, his voice raspy, like someone waking from a long, feverish sleep. It's too late." Tom shook his head. "What are you talking about, Sam? We can't just leave. We need to figure this out." But Sam's expression was distant, as if he wasn't speaking to Tom anymore. He was looking past him, staring into the thickening fog outside, his face drawn with an eerie resignation. "It's already here," Sam whispered. "It's already part of us." Tom felt a surge of panic. "No, Sam. Snap out of it. We can still get out of here. We can." Sam's eyes locked onto Tom's, his face now eerily calm, as though he had made peace with something. "There's no way out. Tom." The words hit Tom like a punch to the stomach. He was gasping for air now, the weight of the realization crashing over him. The fog, the whispers, the girl, they were all part of this. And Sam? Sam had already been claimed. Tom turned to the window, and for the first time, he truly saw the forest. It wasn't just dark. It was alive, moving, shifting like something breathing. The trees seemed to stretch and bend toward them, their limbs reaching out as if to grab hold of the car, pulling it deeper into the abyss. He could almost hear them, feel them, closing in. The girl's figure moved closer. She wasn't walking. She was floating, her body drifting through the mist like an apparition. Her arms were outstretched, her fingers twitching with an unnatural rhythm, beckoning them. Tom's blood ran cold. He could feel her presence seeping into the car now, infecting the very air they breathed. Suddenly, the car lurched forward. Tom's eyes widened. The engine roared to life as if it had never been dead at all. The headlights flickered on, but they only illuminated more of the fog, more of the shadows creeping in from all sides. The figure of the girl was now at the window, her face pressed against the glass. Tom's body stiffened, his breath shallow. The car was moving on its own now, sliding through the mist as though it had a mind of its own, a cruel force guiding it deeper into the woods. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, the road an endless void leading to nowhere. "We're part of it now," Sam whispered again, his voice barely audible above the rising hum of the car's engine. "There's nothing we can do." Tom tried to fight it, tried to wrestle control back from the unseen force that had taken over, but it was futile. His body felt like it was no longer his own. The car moved forward, deeper into the darkness, and he could feel the forest pulling him, dragging him towards something he couldn't see, something waiting for him in the mist. The girl's smile widened. The same smile from earlier, impossibly stretched, impossibly wrong. She reached out to the car, her hands sliding across the window, leaving dark smears behind. But it wasn't just the girl now. It was something else. Something far worse. The forest had claimed them. And as the car continued to move forward, as the fog thickened and the shadows closed in, Tom realized that they were no longer in control of their fate. The forest had always been waiting for them. And now, it had them. They would never leave.